Tell me the truth.
I did it. And I never meant for you to get hurt.
She had him by the collar before he could blink. His back hit the wall with a sound like a gunshot, and every soldier in the room froze. Commander Valis of the Kasiri Empire, 7 feet of silver-armored predator, mandibles flared, compound eyes burning with something between fury and fascination, leaned in close enough that he could smell the ozone rolling off her suit. And then she said it. What are you? What enos who? What? Lieutenant James Harker had been asked that question before, by diplomats, by generals, by alien ambassadors who smiled with too many teeth, but none of them had asked it the way she was asking it, pressed against a wall, her forearm across his chest, 2 tons of political fallout teetering on whatever he said next. He looked at her. He looked at the room full of Cathari soldiers gripping their weapons, and then he smiled, because the honest answer was going to change everything. He was human, and nobody in this galaxy had ever really understood what that meant. James Harker had been a problem since the moment the Cathari first made contact with Earth's Deep Space Relay Station 7 months ago. Not a political problem, not a military problem, a conceptual one. The Cathari had spent 400 years cataloging every sapient species in the galaxy, and they had rules for all of them. The Karathi were logic-driven and cold. The Mirian were empathic and communal. The Veldon were aggressive and territorial. Every species fit into a category, and every category had a diplomatic protocol. Then they found humans, and the categories stopped working. On their first day aboard the Cathari flagship Eternal Precedent, the human delegation had done 3 things that no species had ever done before. They'd laughed at a Cathari honor duel, not from disrespect, but because one of the combatants had slipped, and apparently humans found physical mishap hilarious. They'd asked if the ship's cook could teach them to make Cathari flatbread. And then their medic, a small woman from somewhere called New Zealand, had climbed up onto a surgical table and fallen asleep in the middle of a diplomatic briefing. Not from disrespect, not from exhaustion. She was just, she said, a napper. The Cathari had spent 3 days trying to classify these behaviors. They gave up on day 4. Commander Valis had been assigned to monitor the humans. That was the official story. The unofficial story was that the High Council was terrified of them and needed someone competent to figure out why. Valis was the best analyst in the fleet, a veteran of 40 campaigns, someone who had decoded the military doctrine of 6 species within the first hour of contact. She'd read every translated scrap of human data they had, history files, entertainment archives, biological reports, and she'd come away with something she rarely felt. She'd come away confused. Humans were simultaneously the most fragile and the most dangerous thing the Cathari had ever encountered. They healed slow. They needed food and water every few hours. They couldn't survive vacuum, extreme cold, or radiation without elaborate artificial protection. Their bones broke. Their skin tore. Their hearts, tiny, wet, exposed organs, stopped if you looked at them wrong. By every metric the Cathari used to assess military threat, humans were a 2 out of 100. And yet, their history files were something else entirely. James Harker hadn't planned to become the most talked-about human in the galaxy. He was a lieutenant. He ran logistics. He was good at his job because he paid attention to things other people ignored. Supply chains, morale curves, the way stress accumulated in a crew over a long mission. He noticed things, he remembered things. And 7 months into his posting on the Eternal Precedent, he had noticed something that nobody had told him to notice. Something that, as it turned out, was at the center of everything. The Cathari were losing, not to humans, not to any one enemy. They were losing to time and entropy and the slow, grinding math of a war they'd been fighting for 80 years against an enemy called the Veldon. The Veldon were everything the Cathari feared. Fast reproducing, decentralized, impossible to negotiate with because they didn't have a central government, just a billion fragmented clans united by a single shared drive. Expand or die. The Cathari had been holding them back for 3 generations, but holding back wasn't winning, and the numbers were tipping. James had seen it in the supply manifests. In the casualty reports, nobody translated for the human delegation. In the way Commander Valus looked at star maps when she thought no one was watching, that specific expression humans made when they were doing math they didn't like the answer to. He'd learned to read Cathari faces in the same way he'd learned to read the faces of exhausted soldiers back home. There was only one face for "we're running out of time." It looked the same in any species. So he'd started asking questions, carefully, to the junior officers who found him fascinating, to the engineers who liked how he asked about their work. Over weeks, he'd assembled a picture that the Cathari had been very carefully not showing their human observers. And when he had enough pieces, he'd gone to Commander Valus's strategy room, alone, at night, when he knew she'd be working. And he'd put a data tablet on her table with his analysis on it. Then he'd waited. He hadn't expected her to grab him. That was the moment, back to the wall, her forearm across his chest. Every soldier in the room with a weapon half raised. And Valus, brilliant, controlled, unreadable Valus, looking at him like something fundamental had just shifted in her understanding of the universe. "What are you?" she'd said. And he'd smiled. And now he had to explain. He told her the truth, the real truth, not the diplomatic version, not the carefully managed version that the Earth Council preferred to share. He told her what humans actually were. Humans were survivors of a war they had almost lost so completely that the word almost was doing a lot of heavy lifting. 65,000 years ago, their species had been down to a few thousand individuals in East Africa, hammered into near extinction by a volcanic winter. They'd crawled back from that. They'd survived ice ages and plagues and famines and every form of violence they could invent, and they were extraordinarily creative at inventing violence. They'd gone from sharpened sticks to nuclear weapons in about 10,000 years, which by galactic standards was less than an eye blink. They'd tried to destroy themselves at least 4 times with their own technology and pulled back from the edge every single time. Not because they were wise, but because some of them refused to stop trying. That was the thing about humans, he told her. They had a word, persistence, but the word didn't capture it. It wasn't just that humans kept going. It was that humans kept going past the point where any rational actor would stop. Humans didn't have a surrender reflex the way other species did. Other species had evolved the ability to recognize a lost fight and withdraw. It was good survival strategy. It was smart. It made sense. Humans had something else. A small, irrational, completely insane subroutine somewhere in their hindbrains that looked at lost and said, "Okay, but what if we tried one more thing?" Valus was very still. He kept going. He told her about their history, about a battle where a civilization called Sparta had held a mountain pass with 300 soldiers against an army of 300,000, not because they thought they would win, but because the time they bought mattered. About a war where a country had coded its most critical intelligence operation into crossword puzzles because no enemy would believe something that important could be hidden somewhere that ridiculous. About a species that had looked up at the stars, with no technology, no ships, no tools beyond what they could carve from stone, and decided that getting up there was a reasonable ambition, and spent the next several thousand years working toward it. He told her about a concept humans had called morale, how it was, functionally, the decision to continue fighting when the math said stop. How humans had learned to manufacture it deliberately, to maintain it under conditions that would break the will of most species. How, in their darkest wars, they'd made music in trenches and told jokes under bombardment and painted murals on the walls of besieged cities. Not because it changed the tactical situation, because the alternative was to stop being human, and they would not stop being human. Commander Valus hadn't moved in 4 minutes. She was listening with everything she had. It was Tatumets. Nano. He laid the analysis out for her then. The full picture he'd assembled from the supply manifests and the casualty reports and the star maps. The Veldon's expansion pattern had a weakness, not a tactical one, not a military one, a mathematical one. Their decentralized structure meant they expanded in all directions simultaneously, which sounded terrifying until you realized it meant they couldn't concentrate force. They were everywhere, which meant they weren't anywhere. And there was a specific corridor, a specific window of about 18 months, where a coordinated offensive at 3 key relay nodes would fracture their logistics across an entire sector. Not destroy the Veldon. You couldn't destroy a billion fractured clans, but fragment them, break them into pieces small enough that the Cathari could manage them individually, stop the bleeding, buy time for a real peace settlement. The Cathari had looked at this problem for 80 years and hadn't seen it. He'd seen it in 3 months because he was from a species that had survived by recognizing when a seemingly overwhelming enemy had the kind of weakness you only found if you were desperate enough to look. Valis finally let him go. She stepped back, she looked at the data tablet. She looked at him, and she asked him something that he hadn't expected. She asked him why. Why had he done this? He wasn't Cathari. This wasn't his war. Earth hadn't been invited to participate. They were observers, guests, barely tolerated curiosities. He could have said nothing. He could have taken his information back to the Earth Council and let them decide what to do with it. Why had he come to her? He didn't hesitate. Because people were dying, he said. Cathari people, Veldon people, probably, in a war none of them had asked for either. He'd seen the casualty reports, he'd learned to read Cathari names, and he'd watched those names pile up on the lists week after week. It didn't matter that they weren't his people, they were people. His brain didn't know how to look at people dying and file it under not my problem. That was, he said, maybe the central thing about humans. They were terrible at not my problem. They'd invented the concept of going across an ocean to help strangers they'd never met because those strangers were in trouble, and they'd felt, somehow, inexplicably, obligated. It was a design flaw, maybe. It was certainly inconvenient, but they couldn't seem to get rid of it. There was a long silence in the strategy room. Then Commander Valis did something nobody in the room had seen her do in 11 years of service. She laughed. Not the Cathari equivalent of a laugh, mandibles clicking with polite amusement. She made the sound she'd been studying in human cultural archives for 7 months. She threw her head back and she laughed, loud and sudden, and it echoed off the walls of the eternal precedent. And every soldier in the room looked at each other with expressions that said, plainly, that they did not know what was happening, but it seemed important. She told him, still laughing, composing herself, mandibles clicking in a way that he was starting to understand meant genuine delight, that his species was either the most dangerous thing in the galaxy or the most valuable, and she hadn't decided which. Maybe both. Probably both. He told her it was definitely both. They'd been told that before. The offensive plan was presented to the High Council 6 weeks later. Not by James Harker, by Commander Valis, because a lieutenant with no formal standing couldn't present to the High Council, and because humans, Valis had learned, were remarkably unconcerned with credit as long as the thing got done. 3 counselors rejected it on principle because it had originated from an alien observer. The other 4 approved it. The deciding vote came from the High Chancellor, who had apparently spent her own quiet hours going through those human history files, and had come away with the same question everyone came away with. How does a species survive everything they survived and come out the other side still trying to help strangers? The answer she'd settled on. You didn't build that by accident. You built it by choosing, again and again, over tens of thousands of years, to be the kind of thing that helped. To be the kind of thing that looked at a war that wasn't yours and couldn't look away. To be the kind of thing that pressed against a wall with every option exhausted, found one more option. The operation launched 4 months later. It worked. Not perfectly, nothing worked perfectly, and humans had a saying about that too. Something about perfect being the enemy of good, but it worked well enough. The Veldon fragmented exactly as the model predicted. The bleeding slowed. Negotiations opened for the first time in 40 years. James Harker went back to running logistics. He was good at it. He paid attention. Commander Valis filed a report to the High Council recommending that Earth be elevated from observer status to full Allied membership in the Cathari Compact. Her reasoning was straightforward. The question wasn't whether humans were useful. The question wasn't even whether they were dangerous, because they absolutely were. The question was what kind of thing you wanted beside you when everything went wrong. When everything went wrong, and in this galaxy, in this universe, eventually everything went wrong. You wanted the thing that didn't know how to stop. The thing with the small, irrational subroutine that looked at Lost and said, okay, but what if we tried one more thing? You wanted the thing that laughed under bombardment and painted murals in besieged cities and sailed across unknown oceans to help strangers, not because it was strategically optimal, but because it couldn't look at suffering and call it someone else's problem. You wanted the thing that, pressed against a wall, told you everything. The High Council voted unanimously. Humanity. Strange, fragile, infuriating, relentless, ridiculous humanity was in. And somewhere on the eternal precedent, in the logistics section that nobody ever thought to pay attention to, a lieutenant from a small blue world smiled at a supply manifest and got back to work. Because the work wasn't done. It was never done. And humans were very, very good at that.